and also Chronicle of a Foretold Death, Rushdie has told 100 years of solitude and also of shame and shameless families in Pakistan, India, London, or the United States of America. In The Children of Midnight, he talked about the chronic of a very funny Pakistani and the influence he had and the things were influential to him and to the story of his unsold nation. As well as Joseph Anton, he told us the news of a kidnapping, who actually lived the censorship of freedom of speech when the Ayatollah Joebni condemned him to death and to one of the best English narrators.
Bueno, a la literatura de Salman Rushdie no le hacía falta el escándalo, pero ocurrió. Cuando apenas publicaba su tercera novela, Rushdie fue reconocido por la revista Granta como uno de los 10 jóvenes escritores más talentosos de la lengua inglesa, dentro de una generación en la que vaya que costaba trabajo destacar, pues formaban parte de ella narradores como el premio Nobel Kazuo Ishiguro, Julian Barnes, Martin Amis y Hanif Kureishi, entre otros. Por su parte, luego de descubrir las primeras obras de Rushdie, Milan Kundera escribió que en ningún otro lugar de la literatura contemporánea la influencia de Rabelais corre tan alegremente como por las obras de Rushdie, de Salman Rushdie.
To Rushdie's literature, really scandal is nothing to miss. As it occurred, when he had just published his third novel, Rushdie was known and acclaimed for the Granta magazine as one of the 10 most talented youngest writers of English language. Among a generation in which was hard to stand out because they were part of narrators of a generation part of the Nobel Prize, Kazuo Ishiguro, Julie Barnes, Martin Amis, and Hanif Kureishi, among others. On this side, and after discovering the first Rushdie novels, Milan Kundera wrote in his novels that Rushdie novels are distinguished by an extraordinary perception of real mixing with an imagination that goes beyond rules and what it's likable and not. And he insisted that no other place in contemporary literature the old influence of Rabelais runs so vividly among his work, of this novelist.
Fiel al espíritu de la novela, que no se detiene ante prejuicios ni lugares comunes. En 1989, Salman Rushdie publicó Los versos satánicos, una joya novelesca que no puede dejar de leerse sin enormes sonrisas, una gran cantidad de asombro y constantes muestras de aprecio y solidaridad hacia los personajes y el mismo autor. Al verse entre falsos profetas y asesinos, uno de los personajes sostiene que la misión del poeta es nombrar lo que nadie se atreve a nombrar, denunciar el engaño, tomar partido, iniciar discusiones, dar forma al mundo e impedir que se duerma. Esta novela no pasó inadvertida. Como ha contado el mismo Salman Rushdie en sus memorias, los años posteriores constituyeron una prueba de la que no todos los escritores del mundo habrían salido victoriosos, pues se necesitó una gran confianza en la literatura y una enorme capacidad de trabajo para crear más novelas deslumbrantes, a pesar de verse obligado a escribir bajo las condiciones más adversas que uno puede imaginar.
In 1989, Rushdie published The Satanic Verses, a literature jewelry that only gives us smiles, a great amount of astonishment and dazzling.
And also a lot of gestures of appreciation and solidarity among the characters and to the same author, the author himself. Among so many false prophets, one of the characters holds this to be true. The mission of a poet is to name that what cannot be, that other people won't dare to name, and to denounce trickery and lies, to take a stand and initiate discussions that shape the world, and they stop that it lies and sleeps on. This novel wasn't. It didn't go on the dark, as it had been told by Rushdie in his memoir on the of the years after that were also part of this test, that not all writers would have come out victorious, because you need to be someone with a great courage and confidence in literature, and with enormous capacity of work to create more astonishing novels, and despite having to write under the conditions most adverse that one can imagine.
Los escritores están obligados a encontrar las palabras intraducibles o perdidas de su tribu, que un gran narrador puede hablar de personajes como si fueran países y de países como si fueran personas, que todas las historias están recorridas por los fantasmas de otras historias, y que son los cuentos y los relatos quienes aglutinan a las familias y a los países y les dan sentido. Y Salman Rushdie ha seguido tomando riesgos. En sus 2 novelas más recientes contó cómo los demonios malvados que habían sido encerrados en botellas o lámparas lograron escapar o invadir el mundo, y cómo solo sus hermanas, las mujeres genio, le supusieron resistencia. 2 años, 8 meses y 28 días es una de las mejores novelas que ha escrito Salman Rushdie en los últimos años. Algo semejante ocurre con su estupenda versión personal del Quijote, donde un agente de viajes que recorre los Estados Unidos se ve a sí mismo como un hidalgo que se ve involucrado en un amor imposible y en una historia de ciencia ficción.
In Rushdie's novels, one can discover that writers are forced to find the words which are untranslatable or lost inside the tribe, with a grand narrator who can speak characters as if they were countries, and countries as if they were people, that all stories are walked through ghosts and of other stories, and whose are the tales and the stories that come together and that make families and countries come together. And he's still taking this risk. His last 2 novels, he told us how evil demons had been locked inside bottles and lamps, and they were able to escape and invade a world. And how only his sisters, the genie women, they were the ones who fought against them. 2 years, 28 weeks and 8 days is one of the most brilliant novels by Rushdie. And something similar happens in the stupendous version, his own version of El Quijote, where he is a travel agent that looks at himself as an hidalgo, that he is inside this impossible love and a science fiction story.
Bueno, como ustedes saben, Salman Rushdie en sus novelas es un habitante del mundo. Si pudiéramos registrar en qué medida aparecen diversas ciudades o países en la literatura de Salman Rushdie, un análisis provisional indicaría que lo han influido la India en un 30%, Pakistán en un 27%, Inglaterra en un 22%, los Estados Unidos en otro 18%, distintas ciudades del mundo en un 1% y Guadalajara en un sobresaliente 2%. Porque como ustedes recordarán, El cielo bajo sus pies comienza en esta misma ciudad jalisciense con una fiesta estupenda, en la que participa ni más ni menos que un descendiente lejano de Pedro Páramo, y concluye en Tequila, durante un fin de semana lleno de excesos dignos del realismo mágico, muy similar a la visita que se dice vivió el mismo Rushdie cuando pasó por la Feria Internacional del Libro de esta ciudad. Pero solo Dios es grande y sabe cuánto de esa novela es ficción y cuánto forma parte de la historia secreta de Salman Rushdie y de Guadalajara. Bueno, perdonen ustedes esta lluvia macondiana y los incidentes técnicos con los que arrancó esta conversación, pero ya estamos listos para proseguir. Solo quiero decir que acompañados por el periodista cultural Gerardo Lammers y por algunos de los escritores, periodistas, intelectuales y artistas más admirados y entrañables de esta ciudad, esta tarde están ustedes invitados a conversar, a formar parte de esta conversación con uno de los mejores narradores del mundo, uno que provoca admiración y lealtad. Bienvenidos a conversar sobre las novelas y la literatura de Salman Rushdie. Bienvenido, Salman, muchas gracias.
Well, now I want to welcome everybody, and sorry for the waiting and the technical issues. I'm here with a writer, Gerardo Lammers, and we're also with Salman Rushdie. And thank you very much to all for being here. This is for all of you to participate. And thank you, Salman. Thank you for being with us.
Of course, it's a great pleasure. Great pleasure. Thank you.
Pero nos escuchas. Quisieras, would you like to start talking about your career? We will all like to hear about how do you began to write,
Yes.
about your early years and about the things that had happened until now, up until now.
Yeah. Well, many of the writers you mentioned of that time were very successful when they were very young. You know, they began immediately and understood who they were. For me, it was not like that. It took me some time to understand who I could be as a writer and what kind of work I could do. And I guess the answer to the question came by going back to my childhood. And I began by thinking to write a novel about childhood. And then it somehow exploded from that and became a novel not only about my childhood and growing up, but also the childhood and growing up of the country where I was born. You know? And so the country and the character became, in a way, twins. They became related. And that became the novel Midnight Children, and it allowed me to find my voice as a writer, I think. You know, and in the beginning, I think what I was trying to do as a writer was to make sense of the world from which I had come. You know, and then after a time, I thought, okay, I have to turn my attention to the world that I came to. You know, and I think in my life, it's been a journey back and forth from the place of beginning to the place of arrival. And I'm fortunate, I think, in that I have these three worlds that are available to me as a writer, in India, in England, and in the United States. Or to put it more precisely, three cities, Bombay as it was, London, and New York. And my work seems to go back and forth between them. And so I belong to three cities, and the work has come out of that very largely.
¿Qué tal, Mr. Rushdie? Es un placer tenerlo con nosotros esta noche aquí en Guadalajara, capital mundial del libro. Buenas noches.
Hi, it's a pleasure to have you here in Guadalajara tonight. Welcome again.
Thank you. Well, I've been, to the book fair a number of times, so it's nice to be back.
Yo he venido a la feria varias veces, a la feria de Guadalajara, así que sí, es muy agradable estar de vuelta.
Gracias, Mr. Rushdie. Vamos a iniciar esta ronda de preguntas con periodistas y profesionales que se dedican a la defensa de los derechos humanos aquí en México, con la joven escritora tapatía jalisciense Abril Posas, a quien le voy a ceder la palabra y vamos a ver su pregunta.
We will make now a round of questions with all professionals, writers, and human rights defenders from the city. What comes first, freedom or literature? Is it freedom a pre-existing condition of literature, or is it a conquest that we have to make? Now I will try to use some of the content in the memoirs by Joseph Anton, this book that you wrote. And is it this happy condition surrounding you that you were living in your childhood? Was it the condition that gave you the possibility to imagine everything you wanted, all the demons, all the angels, and who permitted you to write about this? Or was it after? writing these famously known book, The Satanic Verses, that you acquire this this consciousness that you had the imagination and the possibility to do this? What happens first? Is it freedom something you're given with, or is it something that is taken from you with literature?
You know, I think truthfully, freedom is something which most people in the world do not have. There are some societies which are freer than others, but in many societies, freedom is very curtailed, is very restricted. And so literature, in a way, happens in spite of that. It happens in spite of that. Because I think in order to write, the writer must assume that he is free. He must assume that he is free, because if you don't make that assumption, you can't begin. And sometimes that assumption is wrong. You know, so, for example, when Osip Mandelstam wrote his poem satirizing Joseph Stalin, he may have assumed that he was free, but he spent the rest of his life in labor camps. But the assumption of freedom is very important for writing. And I think when I started out, that I assumed that I could write anything I wanted, you know, and that there would be no restrictions about that. I mean, I still think that, in spite of having had some difficulties at some point. I still think the only way of writing is to assume that you have the freedom to write about whatever you want. You know? And the only test is whether you do it badly or well. And as far as childhood and so on, I think it was very fortunate to grow up in a place like India, where there are so many fantastic stories all around you. You know, where from childhood you are surrounded with the literature of the fantastic. You know, whether it's animal fables or epic narratives in which gods and miracles interact with human beings. For that to become the first idea of literature to which you're exposed gives you a kind of freedom. It says you can do all this. You know, so I do think that having had the fortune to grow up in that kind of a literary context did give me a certain liberty to do things which were not conventional, you know, with my work. So I hope that answers some of your question.
Es un privilegio muy grande que nos haga coincidir en Guadalajara, capital mundial del libro, una circunstancia merced a la cual Salman Rushdie, y una ciudad que se ha distinguido por ser la cuna de la Feria Internacional del Libro en Lengua Española más importante del mundo y la segunda en el ámbito bibliográfico del planeta Tierra, para plantearle al escritor indio-británico un planteamiento a partir de lo que desde su triple trinchera de habitante de este planeta, desde 1947, pocas semanas antes de que la India se emancipara del Imperio Británico, y desde su calidad de exiliado en el campo de la libertad de expresión, luego de publicar sus versos satánicos y desde la experiencia de su novela Quijote y 2 años, 8 meses, 28 días, que implica para él en el siglo XXI su compromiso con la palabra, desde el ejercicio y el oficio de escribir, desde la narrativa hasta el campo que como intelectual esto supone en un mundo que busca referentes. Y evidentemente desde lo que esto, desde el campo de lo sagrado implica.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have Mr. Rushdie here at Guadalajara, because this is the city where the second biggest book fair happens, as well as it is now the book capital city. I would like to ask you, since you are a person who lives from three trenches, India, London, and Bombay, and since you were born in 1947, before India was independent, just a few weeks before that. And from all your experience regarding the freedom of expression after you wrote the Satanic Verses and also the Quixote, I would like to ask you, what does it mean to you, and what is your commitment with the word now in this world that needs references?
If the question is about freedom of expression, as I understand it, is that correct?
Yes, and it's about also the commitment with the word and the narrative and the world that needs references right now.
Well, I mean, commitment is a kind of thing which a writer has to have all his life, you know, and without it, there is no work. I mean, I think
eso es algo que es parte de la vida de todo escritor y sin él no es nada.
I think it is true, I think, that the question of free expression has become more problematic as time has gone on.
La pregunta sobre la libre expresión se ha vuelto más problemática conforme avanza el tiempo.
And I mean, that is certainly true now in my country of origin, India. There is an enormous attack by the government against free expression, and there are a lot of reprisals against writers and journalists and so on who criticize the government. So India, strangely, having been a liberal democracy for a long time, is becoming more authoritarian, I'm sorry to say.
Pues poniendo de ejemplo mi país de origen, India, el cual ha tenido un gobierno pues desafortunadamente autoritario que ha atacado la libertad de expresión, ha habido represión en contra de periodistas y de escritores que critican al gobierno. Entonces es el caso de India, que a pesar de ser una democracia liberal, se ha convertido en un país autoritario, lamento decir.
I mean, I do a lot of work with the writers' organization PEN, and what we have found is that the situation of writers around the world is not improving. If anything, it's getting worse. There are more countries in which writers are persecuted than used to be the case.
Yo trabajo con la Asociación de Escritores PEN y nos damos cuenta que la situación alrededor del mundo para los escritores no está mejorando, de hecho está empeorando. Esto es algo común en muchos países.
But as I was saying before, I think one just has to make the decision of freedom and to write from that place. You know, I mean, in a way, I think it's the problem that happened with the Satanic Verses overshadows other work of mine in a way that's frustrating, because, to put it simply, that was my 5th published book, and the book that I will publish next year is my 21st. You know, so 3/4 of my life as a writer has happened since that time, and I mean, I'm quite proud of it. I don't feel that this book that I wrote more than 30 years ago is something that should, in a way, define who I am as a writer.
Antes, como lo he dicho antes, la libertad tiene que decir una decisión. Es decir, debemos de escribir desde la libertad, desde ese lugar. Cuando se publicaron los versos satánicos, me di cuenta que esta novela de alguna manera opacó mis trabajos anteriores como escritor. Para ponerlo de una manera simple, los versos satánicos fue mi 5.º libro y el que estoy por publicar va a ser el número 21. Es decir, 3/4 partes de mi vida han sucedido desde entonces. Y pues no me puedo sentir orgulloso de decir que he sido un escritor conocido por 30 años por este único libro.
I should say that I'm really very proud of the Satanic Verses. I'm not trying to reject it in any way. I think it's just fine, but I've just done a lot of work since then.
No quiero decir que no me siento orgulloso como tal de los versos satánicos, sino creo que está bien, pero que también he hecho mucho más trabajo desde entonces.
Gracias. Vamos ahora en vivo con el periodista político de Guadalajara, Rubén Martín. Adelante, Rubén.
Bien, es un honor, señor Salman Rushdie, participar en esta charla con usted. Bienvenido a través de este medio aquí a Guadalajara y lo esperamos de nuevo próximamente. Mi pregunta va a ser muy concreta. Sé que usted también está al pendiente de la situación política y en este momento hay fuerzas políticas de derecha, conservadoras, que pretenden combatir o eliminar derechos que han ganado grupos sociales como minorías raciales, mujeres o grupos de la diversidad sexual, como ocurre ahora en Estados Unidos y como se corre el riesgo si Donald Trump se reelige como presidente. Y también pasa en otras partes posibles. La pregunta concreta es si ve posible un ascenso del fascismo en los próximos años en Estados Unidos y en otras partes del mundo.
I think I understood the question. Look, let me say this. I'm very careful about using the word fascism because I think it is overused. I was just a few weeks ago in Italy, and I was looking at some of the products of the time of Mussolini, and yes, that was fascism. You know, in America, I don't think we're there yet. You know, I mean, I think it would be wrong to say that that was the case. But a number of preconditions of fascism exist here. One of the techniques of that extremist philosophy is to destroy people's belief in the truth. It is to persuade people that they are being lied to all the time. And once you say to people, everybody is lying to you, the next step is believe in me because I am the truth. You know, and at that point, the dictator arrives. You know, now we're not there yet. We're not there yet. And I think Donald Trump is actually too stupid to be a dictator. But there could be a second version of Donald Trump who might be less stupid. So it's a very dangerous time in America, I think. It's dangerous on a number of counts. It's dangerous if you're Black. It's dangerous if you're a woman. It's dangerous if you're gay. It's dangerous if you annoy somebody who has a gun, because you know there are now more guns in private hands in the United States than there are people. So that is all true, and that's all extremely dangerous. And the fear of what happens if the Republican Party returns to power is very real, because at the moment it gives every sign of no longer being a democratic party. You know, and that is the situation we face here, that only one of the two major parties appears to be committed to the ideas of democracy. And the other one, not so much. So yeah, we're on the edge, but we're not there yet.
Así es, creo que la palabra fascismo se usa muy fácilmente y a veces de más. Incluso hace poco que estuve en Italia y vi los productos del tiempo de Mussolini y sí, eso sí era fascismo, pero creo que si la usamos ahora nos equivocaríamos. Aunque ciertamente existen un número de precondiciones, como por ejemplo el decirle a la gente que les están mintiendo todo el tiempo, el decirles, todos te mienten, cree en mí, yo soy la verdad. No estamos ahí todavía, pero además creo que Donald Trump es muy tonto para ser un dictador. Sí son tiempos peligrosos en Estados Unidos, por ejemplo, si eres negro, si eres mujer o si eres gay, o incluso si molestas a alguien con un arma, porque ahora hay más armas que personas. Pero sí, el miedo de poder, pues, de que esto sea algo real es muy posible porque el Partido Demócrata dejó de ser precisamente un partido demócrata.
I mean, there are things in America that I would not have believed would have happened. For example, the desire to ban children from reading certain books. And these books include many great writers, including Toni Morrison, William Faulkner, etc. These are apparently so books apparently are dangerous for children, but machine guns, which walk into children's schools and murder them, should be defended. And this is the world we live in which the machine gun is more protected than the book. And that's a kind of insanity. And that's a version of the current American insanity.
Hay cosas que pasan en Estados Unidos que no me hubiera creído. Por ejemplo, los niños se les está prohibiendo leer cientos de libros de autores geniales y estos aparentemente son peligrosos, pero en cambio las armas que entran a sus escuelas y los matan, es así, aparentemente tienen que defenderse.
La siguiente pregunta, Mr. Rushdie, está en video y es de la periodista, cronista y profesora Vanesa Robles. Adelante con la pregunta.
The next question will be a video.
Todo indica que en México hay por lo menos 100,000 personas desaparecidas y otros cientos de miles más de personas asesinadas. ¿Qué tendría que decir la literatura ante una realidad como esta? Por otra parte, ¿sería creíble una novela que hable de esta situación en los llamados países desarrollados?
I don't need to point out that in this country there has been 100,000 disappeared people and more hundreds of thousands are murdered. What does literature can say about this reality? Is it, and another thing is it credible, a novel that speaks about the situation to the developed countries, to the so-called developed countries?
You know, I don't think it's my place to tell Mexican writers what they should write about or how they should write about it. You know, I'm sure that this tragedy is very much in people's minds. You know, in the minds of many writers and artists. The tragedy is on such a scale that it sounds like magic realism. You know, it sounds like an enormous exaggeration, except that it happens to be true. There's always been a big problem in literature about how do you write about great atrocity. You know, to write about the Holocaust, very, very difficult. Either you turn your face away from it, or if you look at it too clearly, it's very hard for people to read it. And so atrocity is one of the big problems, I think, for literature. How you describe absolute horror. You know, writers have found different techniques for doing it. I think the way in which people have written about the Holocaust is maybe some kind of a guide, that people find various kinds of indirection to write about it. It's hard to write about. It's hard to look at too much in the face because it becomes unbearable. So the question is, how can you do justice to the subject without writing about it in a way that is unbearable to read? You know, and I think that's it's a question that every writer has to answer for themselves. But I think it's a real issue. It's a real problem, and it is everywhere. You know, for Cambodians to write about the atrocity of the Khmer Rouge, it's almost impossible. You know, so wherever in the world there has been great atrocity, it's a real challenge to literature to respond to it, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. We should obviously try.
No creo que me corresponda decir sobre qué deberían escribir o no los mexicanos. Esta tragedia definitivamente es una tragedia que vive en la mente de muchas personas y suena como realismo mágico, muy exagerado, excepto que es verdad. Entonces, ¿cómo se escribe sobre las atrocidades? O lo ves de lejos o lo ves muy de cerca, pero es muy difícil verlo de cerca. ¿cómo describes el horror? Es cierto que existen técnicas y como hacer una guía para poder verlo, sin embargo es muy difícil verlo y cuando lo ves de frente es insoportable. Entonces, ¿cómo lo escribes sin que sea algo insoportable? En todos los países del mundo han sucedido tragedias y atrocidades que son difíciles de describir, sin embargo, eso no significa que no debamos hacerlo o al menos intentarlo.
Do you want to add something, Mr. Rushdie, about this question?
No, I think I'll leave it there.
La siguiente pregunta está en video y es del periodista Ricardo Solís, del diario El Informador.
Next question is on video. It's from Ricardo Solís. He's a journalist working with El Informador.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Ricardo Solís, de Guadalajara, México. Trabajo en el periódico El Informador. Y mi pregunta para el señor Rushdie es: ¿qué debería tomar en consideración, sea un escritor o no, alguien que se dirija a un público de niños o jóvenes, para hablarles de la literatura de un modo que busque convocarlos a ella o atraerlos a ella? ¿Qué se debe tener en consideración cuando se va a hablar de literatura con niños y jóvenes? Muchísimas gracias.
So hi, I'm Ricardo Solís from Guadalajara. I work for the newspaper El Informador. My question is the following. What should one consider when writing, when you want to address children or younger audiences, so you can attract or try to summon them? What should be taken into account when you're trying to speak to this type of audience?
Well, I'm very glad about this question because probably my two favorite books that I ever wrote are the two books that I wrote for my children. So the subject is very dear to me. And I think the first thing one should remember is that children are incredibly intelligent. And that you don't need to talk. The American writer E.B. White, who wrote the famous children's classic Charlotte's Web, for example, he said, you don't talk down to children, you talk up. And I think that's right. You should treat children with great respect because they are very smart and they know rubbish when they read it and they know the good stuff when they find it. And you can tell this because children, unlike grown-ups, have no shame at all about not finishing a book. If they don't like a book, they throw it away. And if they like a book, they read it every day. So these are very, very tough critics. And I think one has to write for them with the idea that you're writing for a very tough critic. You have to be at your very best.
Estoy muy agradecido por esta pregunta porque dos de mis libros favoritos que he escrito fueron para mis niños. Entonces este tema me es de mucho aprecio. Lo primero es saber que los niños son increíblemente inteligentes. Por ejemplo, el escritor E.B. White, que escribió La telaraña de Charlotte, decía que a los niños hay que hablarles para arriba, hay que mirarlos para arriba cuando se les habla y no para abajo, porque a los niños se les tiene que hablar con mucho respeto. Ellos pueden reconocer la porquería y lo bueno cuando lo hayan. Ellos no son los únicos que no tienen la vergüenza de decir que no acabaron de leer un libro. Ellos saben si algo no les gusta, lo tiran. Y si les gusta, lo leen a diario. Entonces son unos críticos muy, muy duros. Pero esto es algo muy importante, que siempre tenemos que considerarlos como grandes lectores.
The other thing about children is they're very easily bored. So it's a very good idea not to bore them.
Otra cosa es que también los niños se aburren con mucha facilidad, así que pues hay que tratar de no aburrirlos.
Which is a good thing for a writer to learn.
Es algo positivo que debe de aprender, que debería de aprender un escritor.
La periodista Rebeca Pérez Vega, de la sección cultural del diario Mural de Guadalajara, tiene la siguiente pregunta para usted, señor Rushdie.
Now, Rebecca Perez from Mural newspaper, she has the following question for you, Mr. Rushdie.
Mi pregunta, Salman, Tiene que ver con su nueva novela, Victory City, centrada pues, en el poder de la mujer y la igualdad. Me gustaría que me platicara un poco qué cree que hace falta para que nuestro mundo se convierta en ese sitio que está construyendo usted en su siguiente novela.
My next question is, well, the question that I have is about Victory City, your next novel, that talks about power and equality. And why do you think that it's taking longer for women to take a place in this, to fight for equality and to take a stand in these times?
I mean, I think the obvious answer is yes. The novel is set many hundreds of years ago. I mean, the novel takes place in South India in the 14th and 15th century. And what was it? One of the things that was interesting to me is that there was a kingdom in South India at that time whose name translates as Victory City. The name was called Vijayanagar. The word Vijaya means victory and the word Nagar means city. So Vijayanagar means Victory City. And in that time, quite impressively, the place of women in the society was much better than in other parts of India at that time or since. For example, there were women who were generals and soldiers. There were women who were judges and lawyers and accountants and entrepreneurs and so on. So even more so than in the more famous Mughal Empire that was in North India a little later, was not as emancipated. But it was interesting to me that in South India, all those hundreds of years ago, there was a moment at which the role of women was better, and for example, in the capital city, there were almost as many schools for girls as there were for boys. All of that I found very interesting, because and quite surprising that this should have happened in like the 14th and 15th century, in a country which is now, in which the place of women now is very problematic, and in which violence against women is increasingly common. So I thought it was interesting to go back all those hundreds of years to look at another way of thinking, and so that's one of the themes of the book. Yeah. But I think, in general, yes, I mean, look what's just happened in the United States. This pushes the place of women back more than half a century. The cancellation of the right to abortion. If I was an American woman right now, I would be very angry and very upset and determined to do something about it. And I think there are American men who think that way too. But we shall see.
Muchos años atrás, en el sur de la India, en el siglo XIV y el siglo XV, algo que me resultó muy interesante con esta novela que se va a publicar fue que hubo un reino que se traduce como la ciudad de la victoria. Y en ese tiempo, algo que es muy impresionante, el lugar de la mujer era mucho mejor de lo que es ahora y de lo que era entonces también en la sociedad en general. Ellas eran generalas, eran soldadas, eran jueces, eran empresarias, etcétera. E incluso en el más famoso imperio de la India, la mujer ni siquiera estaba liberada. Y en ese tiempo, en el siglo XIV y el siglo XV, su posición era mejor. Había escuelas para niños y para niñas. Me sorprendió que pasara en este país, en donde actualmente el papel de la mujer no es tan bueno, hace tantos años atrás. Pensé que eso sería muy interesante de tratar en la novela. Incluso ahora, como ves, en general el papel de la mujer no está tan bien. En Estados Unidos se atrasaron más de 50 años ahora que se abolió el derecho al aborto. Si yo fuera una mujer estadounidense en este momento, estaría muy enojada y muy determinada a tomar acción, pero ya veremos.
Janet Aguilar Sosa, periodista especializada en literatura del diario México, tiene la siguiente pregunta para usted.
We'll have another question from the journalist of the Universal.
Buenas noches, soy Janet Aguilar del periódico El Universal. Uno de los temas que usted más ha abordado es el del poder político. Le pregunto, ¿nunca como hoy vivimos en un mundo polarizado y extremista y con sociedades menos participativas? Y en ese sentido, ¿qué le parece si son las mujeres las que encabezan la lucha más emblemática de este siglo contra el poder patriarcal, tal como lo aborda en su novela Víctor Cidi, que saldrá en 2023 y que tiene como heroína a una chica llamada Pampa Campana? Muchas gracias.
Good evening. One of your topics that is present in your narrative, it's about the political power, and well, never have we seen a world as polarized as today, with fundamentalism and all these struggles. And what do you think about women being the ones who are heading the struggle against patriarchy? Because you have a heroine in your novel that is called Pampa Campana.
Yeah. Well, I think women are at the sharp end of the problem. You know, I think as I say, there are these groups now who are the targets of the political right, and women are obviously the largest of those groups. I think also if I'm speaking from an American perspective, if you belong to a race which is not white, you have also an equivalent problem. You know, so if you're a black woman, you have the problem doubled. And it's not surprising to me that as you look around, you find some of the most powerful voices are the voices of women of color in America. You know, whether it's writers. You know, I think some of the most powerful American writers right now are black women. Like Jesmyn Ward, I could just name it for one, you know, some young woman who has won the National Book Award twice before she's 30 years old, and is a kind of artistic descendant of Toni Morrison. One of the most powerful and effective public voices right now, I think, is the politician Stacey Abrams, who is running for the governorship of Georgia right now. And I think is a possible future leader of the Democratic Party. The question of whether America is ready for a black woman to lead the country is the whole other question. They weren't ready for a white woman relatively recently, so whether they're ready for a black woman is a question. But I do think women in many walks of life, you know, are taking on leadership roles, and it's because they feel the problems of the society most sharply.
Bueno, claro, ellas están en el centro del problema, ¿no? Incluso son las mujeres. Las mujeres son el objetivo de la derecha política. Y estoy hablando como desde la perspectiva estadounidense. Si no eres blanca, tienes un problema, pero si eres negra, tienes un doble problema. Pero si miras a tu alrededor y escuchas las voces de mujeres de color, son muy, muy fuertes. Existe una escritora que es como la heredera artística de Toni Morrison y es una de las voces más fuertes. Existe también Stacey Abrams, que va para la gobernatura de Georgia.
The Swedish Academy has its own ways, and it's not for me to comment, you know. And as far as the government of Iran is concerned, it's a very long time since there was any really serious threat against my life. I mean, it's really more than 20 years. I mean, it's maybe 22, 23 years since there was any real security issue. So I'm happy to say that these days I lead quite a normal life. You know?
Bueno, con respecto a lo de la Academia Sueca y con respecto a lo del gobierno de Irán, la verdad trato de no pensar en ello. No creo que me toque a mí comentar nada al respecto. Realmente hace mucho tiempo es que esta amenaza no ha sido seria para mí. Ya llevo 22, 23 años en los que no he tenido verdaderos problemas de seguridad. He llevado una vida normal hasta ahora.
Mr. Rushdie, quisiera preguntarle en lo personal si usted considera que la literatura puede ayudarnos a entender, a enfrentar y a resolver la violencia.
I'd like to ask you, Mr. Rushdie, if you consider literature can help us understand and stop and fight violence.
You know, I don't like to claim too much for literature. You know, I think there are things that literature cannot do. And I think one of the things it really maybe cannot do is to make the world a better place.
No me gusta darle demasiados créditos a la literatura. Creo que sí hay muchas cosas que la literatura no puede hacer. Y una de esas cosas es, creo, hacer del mundo un mejor lugar.
What I think literature can do at its very best is it can ask people new questions. It can make people think about the world in different ways, in more original ways. It can introduce beauty. It can create beauty, and it can create joy, and it can point to evil, and these are the great matters of human life. We were talking about Saul Bellow earlier. Saul Bellow once said that literature has profound business at the roots of humanity, and I think that is the business that we're in. We have profound business at the roots of humanity, what it is to be a human being. That is what literature can tell us.
Puede crear belleza y alegría, y también puede señalar al mal. Este me parece que son los grandes asuntos de la vida humana. Ya habíamos hablado acerca de Saul Bellow hace un momento, que decía que la literatura tiene profundos asuntos en las raíces de la humanidad. Me parece que esto es verdad. Lo que escribimos son profundos asuntos en las raíces de la humanidad y podemos apuntar a eso y trabajar con eso.
If you want, I can tell you a mischievous story about Italo Calvino and the Nobel Prize.
Please.
Si quieres te puedo contar una historia medio truculenta acerca de Italo Calvino y el premio Nobel.
It so happened that I was having dinner with Italo Calvino on the night that the Nobel Prize for García Márquez was announced.
Yo estaba cenando con Italo Calvino la noche en que el premio Nobel para Gabriel García Márquez fue anunciado.
So eventually everybody was avoiding the question.
Todo el mundo estaba evitando esa pregunta.
Eventually I said, so Italo, what do you think about the news from Stockholm?
Y finalmente le pregunté, Italo, ¿qué te parecen las noticias que vienen de Estocolmo?
He said, it's a scandal.
Él dijo que es un escándalo.
And I said, no, but come on. I said, García Márquez, he's a good writer. He deserves the prize.
Yo le dije, no, Gabriel García Márquez es un buen escritor, él se merece el premio.
And Calvino said, yes, he's a good writer, but he can wait.
Él dijo, sí, es un gran escritor, pero puede esperar.
And then he kind of rescued it, because he then said, for them to give it to García Márquez before they give it to Borges is like giving it to the son before the father.
Después trató de rescatarla diciendo, para que ellos se la den a García Márquez antes de dársela a Borges, es como dársela al hijo antes que al padre.
Bueno, hay muchísimas preguntas más, pero sabemos que tenemos poco tiempo más con usted. Solo nos resta agradecerle y preguntar si nos puede dar algún consejo para todos los promotores de lectura, los profesores de literatura, los libreros independientes y los editores de literatura aquí en Guadalajara. ¿Puede darnos algún consejo?
So there's very little time left, and we would just like to thank you and ask you any advice for the reading promoters, for the literature teachers, for the booksellers, and the independent editors from Guadalajara. Is there any advice you could give to us?
I think they know their job better than I do. But I do think one of the things that is interesting, I don't know if it's the same in Mexico, but in the United States, one of the consequences of the pandemic has been a real increase in the sales of books, that people seem to have rediscovered the joy of reading during the course of these last 2.5 years. And bookstores now in America are opening rather than closing. They're actually flourishing rather than struggling. And somehow this old-fashioned thing, the act of reading, seems to have become more popular. And I hope that is true where you are living as well.
Yo creo que ellos conocen mejor su trabajo que yo, pero algo que me he dado cuenta, sobre todo en Estados Unidos, que es donde estoy, es que de hecho con la pandemia se incrementó la venta de libros. La gente ha descubierto el gusto por la lectura. Como digo, aquí más librerías están abriendo. en lugar de cerrar, en lugar de caer, han estado en realidad floreciendo. Parece ser que la gente ha redescubierto el placer de leer y la lectura se ha vuelto más popular otra vez. Espero que sea también el caso del lugar en donde se encuentra.
Bueno, a nombre del gobierno de Guadalajara y del programa Guadalajara, Capital Mundial del Libro, queremos agradecerle, Salman, todo el tiempo y la generosidad que ha demostrado en esta conversación.
Aquí en Guadalajara, Capital Mundial del Libro. Nos vemos con nuestra siguiente actividad de este programa, que todavía le quedan muchos meses. Muchas gracias, buenas noches.
Okay, good night everybody. Bye.